So I'm really pleased that for today's In Conversation With, I'm joined by Dr Sarah Frodsham, who is Senior Lecturer in Educational Research and member of the STEAM Research Group at Oxford Brookes University. Thank you very much for joining me today, Sarah. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So I'm going to kind of kickstart with perhaps quite a really big question. I recently reread your article that you wrote with Deb McGregor entitled Epistemic Insights, Contemplating Tensions Between Policy Influences and Creativity in School Science in the British Education Research Journal. And in that, you discuss the challenges of policy on creative practice in primary science education. Can you give us a little bit more insight into the current policy for primary science and its impact on creativity?
Yeah, that is quite a big question to start off with there, Victoria. Thank you very much. No, it's a very interesting question as well. The current policy, well, I actually want to go back to something Robin Alexander said in the Cambridge Primary Review, and some might say it's a little while ago now, which is 2010, but I think it's still relevant today, where he states that the aims and of the actual curriculum, science curriculum, let's say, for instance, tend to kind of go in one direction, while the statutory requirements go pragmatically into another. And I think that's actually still quite relevant today. But I suppose what I'm trying to say there is it's not that it's the educational system, the practices within the educational system are pragmatically going in one direction and creativity is going off into the ether. You know, it's the national curriculum itself, certainly within the sciences, that seem to be kind of and doing that. So it's how the teachers interact with that can be very, very different to what the actual documentation is kind of inferring to the teachers who put it into practice. And what's really interesting, in fact, is very, very recently, in fact, only last year, I spent a whole month, and this is not published yet, so, you know, this is kind of a news flash for you. I spent a whole month going through every single bit of the national curriculum, just for science, I admit. I'm still to do it with arts. I spent a whole month looking at the pseudonyms of creativity throughout the entirety of the national curriculum. And I used not just the pseudonyms, I used frameworks like Lucas and Spencer's 5 dispositions of creativity. I used Bruner's definition of agency as well, and I looked at it through a kind of deductive framework that I developed through that. And there was one other, and I believe, and I've actually got it up here, Victoria, even though you can't see it, it was Costa, that's right, it's 16 Habits of Creativity. And I went through the whole of the national curricula using these as deductive frameworks, and to my surprise, inverted commas, I would say, creativity, yes, was in the aims, was in the kind of the definitions of working scientifically, but when it actually came to the requirements, the statutory requirements, it was so limited. You know, it just, you know, and that resonated with me, and it resonated with what Robin Alexander said in 2010, how it's still very much something that's happening now as well, and it just, I don't know, I feel as though the actual documentation, the national curricula itself, is kind of sat there on a shelf, if you know what I mean, and it's how we interact with it, I think, that is key here. So I don't know if that's answered your question, and it was pure coincidence that I spent a whole month doing something that I thoroughly enjoy on my own, doing those sort of pragmatic things. Yeah, but that's my long-winded answer to that question. So.
No, that's really interesting. It's great that you spent that time looking at the documentation. So from what you're saying, that creativity does actually feature in the documentation.
Yeah.
So do you have any insight into potentially some of the causes or impacts of creativity within the classroom? Is it happening? Is it not happening in the science classroom?
I mean, it's fascinating that you've asked me, and I know that I'm kind of taking this. I will answer that question, but what I want to recognise actually is something else, which is an article by Wise and Ferrari, if that's how you pronounce it. I apologise to Ferrari or Ferrari, you know, if I got that wrong now. they wrote it back in 2014 for Burge themselves, and they actually noticed how creativity, again, in the national curriculum documents, wasn't being referred to even within the arts, although within the arts it was referred to 3 times as much than science. And I just found that, again, interesting, the fact that it is associated with the arts more so with science. I will get round to your question, I promise you, Victoria. But I remember interviewing a scientist a while ago now. We just got into conversation post-interview, and it turns out that he didn't actually believe science was creative. He was adamant that it wasn't creative. And, you know, this is a professional scientist working at a very prestigious university. And by the end of our conversation, he actually turned around to the camera and just went, "Science is creative," in a really, really loud voice, because it's like he's had this epiphany. There seems to be, for some reason, this thought that science isn't creative but art is, and that's where STEAM itself is wonderful. I'm not quite so sure the letters should be so distinct from one another, but you know, it's a written word. What can we do about it? But as to it being illuminated into the classroom, now I get to your question, Victoria. Yes, again, it's I've actually just published a website. It's publicly available, and I don't know if you have the capability of putting a little sign at the bottom here to take you through it, because I don't know the URL, but perhaps it can be linked into somewhere.
Yeah, I'll definitely put it in, like, in any documentation linked to this video.
Brilliant. Well, we've been funded externally by the Primary Science Teaching Trust. Thank you very much, Primary Science, there, to go into classrooms and exemplify those creative moments within the science lesson in Key Stage 2. And we've been very fortunate, very lucky that 7 college fellows from the Primary Science Teaching Trust, who have been awarded the Primary Science Teaching Award for creativeness within their science classrooms. We've been very lucky to go in there and actually exemplify moments of creativity, or aspects, I should say, not moments, but aspects of creativity, naturalistically within the classrooms itself. So we've got some lovely videos ranging from 30 seconds to 3 minutes of those kind of aspects of creativity as they are naturally occurring in the science classroom. Now there we have a kind of conundrum, and it's something that we kind of fought with ourselves as we were looking at these videos, because as we all know, and I know you've referred to it in some of your writing, not that I spent last week reading some of your work, Victoria, but there we both know there's such a thing called creative teaching that came out with the NACCCE in 1999, Ken Robinson and his cohort. And you have not just the teachers being creative, but what about the children being creative themselves? So you've got teaching creatively, which is where the teacher is being an imaginative and using all these imaginative, wonderful activities. Perhaps they're stood at the front pretending to be a scientist in role, I don't know. But then you've got teaching for creativity, which is where it's children are being facilitated to be creative themselves. So it's capturing those moments of creativity that the children are actually doing as well, or the pupils, I should say. I shouldn't call them children, I should call them pupils, that the pupils are doing. So we had that tension when we went into the classroom. But what we've done on this website is we've exemplified on one part of the website the teacher being creative, and then we've got other examples of when the children are creative. Pupils are creative. So it's not just a case of we went in and videoed the teacher. We not only went in and mic'd up the teacher and videoed what they were doing, we also mic'd up minimum 8 of the children as well. So we captured everything they said throughout. So we were able to really illuminate what was going on that perhaps an observer who had just entered the classroom and just took field notes, for example, wouldn't have necessarily captured. So yeah, I think I've waffled on long enough, but I think it's absolutely, creativity is still very much evident. And having witnessed it myself over the last 2 years, it's there, you know, and it's about capturing and illuminating those moments rather than just saying, oh, let's spot it when we can. So
Fabulous. I mean, it's really great to hear that creativity is flourishing. And
Mm,
really, what you're talking about there is potentially people being able to recognize creativity, which can often be an issue sometimes because teachers are so focused on assessments and so forth, and making sure that they develop the kind of scheme of work and meet their kind of outcomes, that sometimes there isn't that space to notice some of these kind of happenings in terms of
mm.
young children expressing their creativity within the classroom. So, I mean, from my opinion, sometimes that space isn't necessarily always offered, but
No.
by just offering that space or offering that moment for a teacher to step back to observe a classroom and to see it happening is really important. So, I think that resource and those videos, I think, will be really important for people to, take the opportunity to perhaps be a researcher themselves and see something in practice. That sounds really interesting, and we'll definitely have to link up those resources.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria.
Also, in the article with Deb
Mm,
McGregor, you discuss a report from 2015 by the Confederation of the British Industry that suggested that a step change in teaching was needed to make science exciting, interesting, and challenging. Now, I thought that was a really interesting quote. And it also said to develop skills of reasoning, analysis, and curiosity.
mm.
Has this progressed in science teaching, do you think, since 2015?
Well, has it progressed? I mean, that's quite a tricky question because it's, as you say, it's in teaching. So every teacher is an individual. Every teacher has their own agency to choose to teach science in their way, the way that they feel is the best suited for their charges. So I wouldn't dream of going in and judging a teacher for that, because they are doing that utmost best in the bounded system that they find themselves in. And I think that's brilliant. It's wonderful. It's something that I don't do. I can imagine if I went into a primary science classroom and said, hey, 30 children, it would be complete chaos within 5 minutes. But they are doing a brilliant, brilliant job. Has it progressed? I am going to refer to something by Lippmann, where he talks about moratic thinking, where it's seeking to elicit the best possible thinking from the pupils. So it depends on the individual teacher, I think, as to what they think that best possible thinking is, because there is knowledge that the that the pupils are required to learn, the statutory requirements found within the national curriculum being an example. And there are scientific facts that they need to perhaps somehow illuminate or express, and not just acquire as in these little bits and pieces of knowledge that they can just slot into their kind of mind like some kind of lunchbox, that they can just put it into. But it's about garnering that understanding, and situated within their own kind of cultural, social, and historical context. So it's not just about acquisition. In fact, SFARD, and again, it's 1998, and some people might argue it's, it's a bit out of date, Sarah, but I still think it's relevant. SFARD called this an acquisition metaphor as opposed to a participation metaphor, and I think that's a lovely way of thinking. You can acquire knowledge, or you can participate with knowledge. I mean, certainly, I think we're all guilty of it. I am a former biochemist, and I did it for a decade. And I had a lot of acquired knowledge. But I'm going to put my hands up here and say, well, did I participate? Did I understand that knowledge? And it's only by looking at it through a philosophical, and I can never say that word, a philosophical lens, through my actual PhD, that I really began to understand and appreciate that perhaps, yes, I know, for example, I don't know, I knew all about the electron transport chain. In fact, I was completely obsessed with this, line of proteins and that laid on the inner membrane of the
Straight over my head.
exactly. But did I understand it? I'm not 100% sure. I could regurgitate it until the cows came home. In fact, I could as I said to one of my MA students, I could at the time, I'm not sure I could do it now, but I could write the whole all 20 amino acids chemical structures on a board, and gosh, it would look really impressive when I did it. Did I understand them? I'm not so sure. That's acquired knowledge. So it's about the participatory knowledge. And I think there's a mutual duality somewhere between the two. It's not about one is better being than the other. There's something, and I think that's what the teacher facilitates. And it's that kind of balance between the two, and knowing how to communicate, to verbally exchange with the pupil in order to then find out where their alternative conceptions are, not their misconceptions, but their alternative conceptions are, so they can then kind of discuss that collaboratively as a kind of a group. And that's the bits and pieces that I really try to illuminate in the classroom. It's that mutual collaborative discussion, because whilst there is agency, there is independence, and gosh, that's important, especially somebody like me who spent a whole month looking at the national curriculum in the finite way that I did. It's the collaboration, the talk like you and I are having, even though I seem to be doing most of the talking at the moment, Victoria. That is so intrinsic to creativity as well. You know, as Bruna said, it's the yin and yang, agency and collaboration. They're yin and yang to one another, and it's definitely important within creativity. I could waffle on for hours. Do you mind if I just waffle on a little bit, Victoria?
Please do, Sarah, because what you're saying is really, really important to do with creativity. And as you mentioned earlier, creative teaching, teaching for creativity, and creative learning. So please carry on.
Okay, thank you very much, Victoria. I'm going to admit last night I was sat up and I read your chapter in this book. A little plug for you there.
Oh, there we go. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Really good. Cultural historical activity theory. Very good. Anyway, yeah, your excellent chapter in this book, Creativity, Policy, Partnerships and Practice in Education, by Kim, and I'm not going to pronounce that surname, Pat Thompson and Anne Harris. Go buy it. There you go. Nice plug for you. But one of the things you mention in this chapter is the fact, and you actually yourself draw on 6 specific creative processes as illuminated through I don't know, documents, you know, those seminal key pieces of reading, Guilford, Sternberg, Wallace, the NACCCE report that we all kind of know and love, and the QCA, 2007-2009. And you note that there are 6 specific creativity process components that perhaps we should look for, spot. I'm not sure if we should look for or spot or just naturally let it emerge, but that's another conversation. But you note that there is play, exploration, experimentation, risk-taking, and critical reflection, and finally analysis. And I wonder, this is something that I'm thinking of discussing with you, lots of people are coming up with these kind of 6 key features, and I'm going to name a couple of people I know, you know, Crimin and Chappell, who did a systematic review of 35 pieces of writing recently, and they came up with generating and evaluating ideas, climate of openness, risk-taking, encouraging autonomy and agency, playfulness, and problem solving being the key kind of features to maybe illuminate in the classroom. But I was actually wondering, do we help creativity by looking at specific things, or is it a lot more nuanced, i.e. cultural historically activity theory, Victoria? And I was wondering what your thinking was on that.
I think back when I did my PhD, which is where those 6 components came from. I mean, I came from a background of teaching secondary art and design, and I wanted to do my PhD because I found that my teaching became into a rut. I knew what my GCSE classes needed to do to pass the GCSE a grade C and above.
Yeah.
It was like a set formula, but often I would question, where is the creativity in this for the young people, and where is the creativity in this for me as a teacher? And I just found that in all of the documentation that I had in regards to the school documentation, the national curriculum, my teacher training, I never really understood how to look for creativity within the classroom. It was, as you've kind of described, it was this word that just seems so beyond anything that could potentially happen within the classroom. So what I wanted to do was try to explore, particularly in the art and design classroom, what it could look like. And that's when I came up with these kind of 6 kind of key areas that I worked with teachers and we explored and tried to develop within the classroom. I think what's happened recently, and you've highlighted something really interesting, that there are a lot of us researchers engaged and really like to explore the notion of creativity. And actually what we do need is potentially, or actually, this is a question. I don't know if we do need kind of one clear statement of what creativity is. Does that mean then that everybody kind of fits into the one size fits all of that's what creativity is? Or do we allow it to be a little bit more open and allow teachers to kind of explore creativity within their classrooms based on those young people that are in the classrooms with them? But I do think that a lot of this research, what it is good for, is helping teachers and other researchers really break down the creative process, which I often think is slightly misunderstood about what the creative process actually is. And if we kind of bring the conversation back to this notion of STEAM, for example, which is where we're going to go.
Yeah.
It then becomes, as you mentioned earlier, is creativity just the domain of the arts, which it is not.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, can be a big misunderstanding in schools, is actually what's the role of creativity throughout all subjects? What sort of knowledge is generated and shared between subjects? And for me, things like play are absolutely central to that. And actually something like play is really interesting when we think about the transition of knowledge from early years all the way up to higher education. So I do think that there is a lot of research, as you very rightly said in the Chappell article, the systematic review of creativity, 35 different, that's just a handful of papers.
I know. Yeah.
And yet there are all these definitions. But I do think that what people are trying to understand is the creative process, which I think is central for teachers to look and observe and to think about also within their own classrooms. And the whole aim of research is to open up some of those potentialities for the readers of the research.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that that's why that's important. But I suppose what I've started to tap into then, where we're going with this conversation, is creativity in general, but as I've just mentioned, creativity, and you mentioned earlier as well, and it was in the Durham Commission too, that it can often be perceived as the domain of the arts.
Yeah. But
what do you think is the role of the arts in STEAM that moves it from just STEM to STEAM? What is the role of the arts in that?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's quite a tricky question. Again, Victoria, you're really pushing me. I'm going to take us back in history because, as you quite rightly say in your chapter there, it's about the historical as well. And if you look at somebody like Leonardo da Vinci, I mean, I am not Leonardo da Vinci, I don't pretend to be, but he would have said that if you're not if you can't do art, you're not a scientist. If you're not a scientist, you can't do art. Now, I don't think it's quite so black and white as that, but he envisaged I suppose what you would call the he was a natural philosopher at the time. He wasn't a scientist. Francis Bacon was a natural philosopher at the time. And there's part of me that kind of yearns to go back to that and just say, we are all natural philosophers. Even children are so curious and playful. They are forever doing science without realizing it. And they are forever doing that through art, through painting, through pretending to cook with their peers or whatever it is that they do. So I do very much feel that one is intrinsic to another. Whether sometimes when you read articles, it can feel as though, and I'm sure it's not meant to be in this sense, arts to the rescue. But I don't believe that arts is to a rescue. I believe that all these things facilitate one another. So much so, in fact, that, you know, I was just giving you one example on this website where we had a teaching assistant enroll as Darwin at the front of the class, you know, during this dramatic activity, and we were hot seating Darwin as well. And the children were just the pupils were so into questioning Darwin at this time. They were just completely locked. The questions they were coming up with, because they had dispelled their belief that this female teaching assistant was Darwin. They had completely embodied the notion that this was Darwin sat in front of them. They were coming up with the most wonderful open-ended questions, whereby the teaching assistant, who had by chance knew a lot about Darwin, was able to respond from moments within Darwin's life. For example, you know, putting honey onto some flake flowers and seeing if the bees or wasps or moths would come to them. And it was just so wonderful that the pupils were coming saying, you know, is this moth that's got a 30-centimeter proboscis still out there at this moment? You know, half an hour ago they couldn't even say the word proboscis, and now they were so into it. And so, yeah, I think one is very much intrinsic to another, and it again comes down to the strategies that the teacher chooses to adopt to provide these kind of opportunities for the pupils to actually, you know, think about science through those opportunities, or vice versa, think about science through art. I mean, I don't feel one dominates another. It's about the opportunities. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, and actually your work is situated, we've been talking a lot about primary science, and obviously primary teachers work across the board, across all subjects, which I just think is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I just couldn't imagine trying to be knowledgeable in every subject. So they have a key role, really, don't they, in terms of bridging this understanding of STEAM, for example, because they are teaching every subject. I don't know, do you have any examples or any knowledge of how subjects have come together in a kind of inter-transdisciplinary way before, how teachers have bridged, you know, science and arts together in projects and had any sort of successful outcomes?
Well, interestingly, you should ask that, Victoria. The lesson I was referring to, where the teaching assistant was Charles Darwin, the sequence of the actual activities we used within that lesson was very specific. We did a duologue between, well, I didn't, but the teaching assistant and the teacher did a duologue between Charles Darwin and his wife Emma at the beginning. Then they went on to what we call on the tabletop, which is where the pupils could come up to the front of the classroom and examine all these different pieces of apparatus that Charles Darwin might have had strewn throughout his house, including orchids, wooden pegs, ribbons, all sorts of, fountain pens, wooden fountain pens, etc. And they were allowed to ask questions, or not allowed, but they were facilitated to ask these questions of Charles Darwin and Emma. And then after that, there was a kind of a modelling of being moths and orchids, where we had plastic bottles of varying length, and then party blowers, which were meant to be proboscises, you know, the moth's tongue, even though I shouldn't say that, of varying length as well. So depending on whether you get down to the bottom of the bottle, it depends whether you get a nectar point, and then dependent as to whether you then go on to the next stage, or you're passed away or not and allowed to breed, etc., etc. And then after that, it was the hot seating. Now, I've gone through the whole strategy because it was sequenced in a very specific way for a particular reason, because prior to the actual lesson, we did a pre-lesson assessment to find out what the children knew. So it's not how, I recognise this is not how they know it, this is what they know at the beginning of the lesson. And then right at the end of the lesson, they answered the same 6 questions. And it was phenomenal. They went from, I mean, there was one particular question, which I'm afraid I cannot remember off the top of my head, but at the beginning of the lesson, only 8% of the pupils got that correct. By the end of the lesson, it was 96%. There was a phenomenal jump between the beginning and the end. So something had happened during that lesson. And what was fantastic was the fact that because we had mic'd up 8 of the children, we were able to go back to that data and listen to it, fully transcribe it, and find out what happened or what they were saying, those kind of epistemic moments of illumination. And I don't want to give the game away. I don't want to spoil it. But if you go to the website, which I'm hoping you'll put a link to, you can find what the pupils are saying to each other, because it's not just about the teacher facilitating those conversations, and yes, it is, but you don't realize those little pocket universes within the classroom itself, and how the pupils talk to each other. It was just absolutely amazing that one pupil, completely figured it out, what was going on, and yet he never actually said that to the teacher, and by the end of the lesson you would have never known that he had figured it out. So the fact that we caught that on audio, fantastic. So we're genuinely excited.
So what does that mean for the teacher? I mean, because you asked the questions at the end, so obviously the teacher knew that, from where they were at the beginning to the end, they had learned, they had gathered all that knowledge. What was the teacher's perspective on, did they see the videos? Did they see some of those interactions that they potentially wouldn't have seen if they weren't mic'd up?
No, I mean, obviously there was 31 pupils in that classroom at the time, and it was just, I mean, she had provided them with that opportunity to come and to have those illuminatory interactions, but she herself recognized that she did not, capture that as much as she felt she would have liked to have known, if that makes sense at all. She recognized that. But what's fantastic about it is 9 months later we gave them the same assessment, and whilst we didn't quite have the 96-100% turnout, it was still very, very high. We're still kind of in the 80s and 90%. So it's amazing that 9 months later they can still remember these things through that kind of dramatic enroll science lesson that they'd had. So there's obviously something, and it's about getting to the nub of it. And if you, I did my usual thing of, if you look at Cramin and Chappell's systematic review, which is great, by the way, fantastic job if you're watching. I actually did my usual thing and went through each one of those papers that they chose to use. And I went through each one of them, and I found, and I've actually got them here as if I'm prepared through some kind of Blue Peter moment. Let's see if I can bring it up. Yeah, here we go. That out of the 35, only 6 consisted of observations, and out of those 6, 4 of them had field notes only. One of them was just researcher observations, but only 1 actually had audio of the actual group interactions between the pupils. And I just find that fascinating. I mean, they've done a cracking job with this, literature review, with this systematic literature review. And, I'm certainly referring to it in a lot of my writing now. So thank you very much. But, I've done that kind of in-depth analysis of it. And I just think, to illuminate creativity, to really understand and reflect on what it is that we can do to help facilitate creativity within the classroom. Do we need to perhaps think about audio recording the group work, and then even videoing the group work if we can? And what is it that's stopping us doing that? And that's a good question in itself. So
that's really interesting. I actually have a PhD student, Nikki. If you watch this, I'm shouting out here, and he's actually doing his PhD study on using audio recordings with group composing, because Brilliant. It's exactly the same. It's those hidden interactions. Yeah. But actually, what I think is really quite central in what you're talking about here is that the classroom is not just the domain of the teacher. And actually, it is a shared collaborative space. And therefore, the interactions are not just going to be teacher to pupil.
No.
The interactions are going to be pupil to pupil. And that is important. And the time offered for that is important. But I also wonder if there's something in this kind of inter-transdisciplinary way of working, such as that with STEAM, that, combining science, technology, the arts, that there's something in the types of interactions that are generated through that, the types of knowledge that is generated, that potentially opens up collaboration between peers, between students, between pupils, between one another. So that's a really interesting thing that you've made me think about further in terms of, a STEAM curriculum, STEAM within the classroom, is the role of interaction, collaboration between pupils themselves, and what knowledge that creates.
I mean, that just reminds me of actually. I mean, I finished my PhD back in 2018 now, but one of the things I did do, and admittedly it was only as a kind of a small sideline, was I did look at the child-child interactions, and I actually developed a fresh concept. Well, I was developing a fresh conceptual framework where I not only looked at Neil Mercer's 3 types of talk, I also looked at Alexander's five types of child-child interactions. So you've got the three Mercer's teacher-child, Alexander 5 child-child, and then I merged those together in order to then think about how you can develop creativity through these verbal exchanges, and not only between the teacher and the pupil, but also through the pupil interactions. So what was fascinating that I found was the fact that we're talking here about creativity, and I know in your chapter you talk about being critical and analysis, but being creative and being critical are kind of 2 sides of the same coin, if that makes sense. You've got creative thinking, but you also got critical thinking, and it's by merging those 2 into what Fisher called a critico-creative practice. I think it's back in I always feel as though I'm using literature that's old. It's 1999, but it's still relevant. It's that critico, and it's the creative practices within those verbal dialogues between and that's an interesting dialogue, by the way, but anyway, it's between those 2, between the peers and between the teacher and Vygotti's ZPD, if you will. That's actually really interesting when you get right down into the nub of these things. So it's it's not just about the talking, the verbal exchanges, it's the types of verbal exchanges and that kind of splicing and dicing of the critico and the creative.
I think another thing that's come out in our discussion is just kind of how long a lot of this literature has been around, really. That, actually for 30 years or so now, maybe even longer, creativity has been such a central part that people have been trying to get into the national curriculum. It's been such a kind of a force within, like, the Durham Commission. We have PISA now, who are testing creative thinking, which we know that the UK is not actually, or England's not taking part in. Interesting if people want to check out a little bit more about that. But it is within a lot of the kind of discourse and dialogue in policy. So it is really central. And I'm wondering, just as like a final question, do you think there is a link between creativity and STEAM education? Is there something about creativity, creative practice, creative process that potentially links the kind of STEAM subjects together at all?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because if you think about critico-creative practice, I mean, I'm just trying to think. The Gutenberg Bible, for example, the first ever printing press came from the fact that Gutenberg was walking through a fair and he saw a wine press in action, and he just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take that creative idea and critically re-put it somewhere else, if that makes sense. And it's not just art where you can develop these sort of ideas, the printing press. You also have that critico-creative practice within the sciences. Somebody like Al Haytham back in the 16th century, would take the natural philosopher's ideas at the time and create his own experiments by being critical of those experiments of his peers, of his scholars. And then he wouldn't just come up with results and go, Eureka, I've solved everything, isn't it wonderful? He'd go, okay, I've got these results, how do they compare to the previous scholars? and then he would be critical of his own results. So you've got that iterative, that continual critico-creative practice, keep on going round and round and round. And I think that's something that perhaps, and it's nobody's fault, but the teachers don't always have time to enable themselves to be that reflective. And it's all right for people like you and I who are paid to be reflective in this way, and we can go away and we can spend a month analysing the national curricula, to death. And but teachers perhaps don't have that time for that reflexivity. So it's about somehow enabling them to allow them to have that time, to find that time to think about their practices. And I suppose that's what we were hoping with this website that's now live, and it's only live for about a month, by the way. It will enable them the opportunity, even if small, to go in and watch these short videos of these illuminatory moments, perhaps, and then think about for themselves how they might put it into their practice, how it could be useful for their own practices, because teachers just don't have the time to spend a month analysing the national curricula. And I suppose I don't know if you heard that, I just peeped up, I've got another meeting in 10 minutes. Anyway, yeah, so, it's not about is there a creativity through STEAM? The answer is absolutely yes, there is. It's about, where does that critico-creative practice find itself within that STEAM? How can we help each other throughout all of those actual disciplines? It's not about those. It's like I said at the beginning of this interview, STEAM is made up of 5 letters, so STEAM. Yeah, I was glad. I was going, please don't be the 6th letter. Yeah, and to me, the word itself makes it feel like as if there's 5 distinct letters, but is there? So
I think that is a wonderful place to finish this in conversation with. And actually, you've brought up a really interesting thing for me and for anybody who watches this to ponder, is the actual word STEAM. Is that really representative of what we're talking about here? Are we siloing subjects again into particular areas, perhaps? That is something I'm going to ponder, Sarah, and I think that's a really nice way to close this discussion. I cannot thank you enough for joining me. It's been really wonderful to hear so much insight from you and so much knowledge, and we'll definitely be sharing that website. And
thank you, Victoria.
It's just been really wonderful. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for giving me the opportunity, Victoria, and I'd love to chat to you more about this book, which I have advertised for you as well.